vanished at Turkish airport in 2002. Last footage was rediscovered in 2023. The morning of September 3rd, 2002, found Margaret Helen Patterson standing in her empty kitchen, staring at the airline confirmation email she'd printed the night before. The paper trembled slightly in her weathered hands, hands that had typed thousands of reports, filed countless documents, and held the same coffee mug for over 20 years at Morrison & Associates Insurance. Those same hands now held what felt like her last hope. At 41, Margaret had never traveled alone. Not once. Every family vacation, every business trip, every journey beyond the borders of Cedar Falls, Iowa, had been accompanied by her husband David, her teenage daughter Emma, or at the very least her sister Claire. But David had moved out 3 months ago, taking with him the comfortable predictability of their 18-year marriage. Emma was away at college, calling less frequently each week, building a life that seemed to have no room for her mother's growing desperation. And Claire, bless her heart, had her own family to worry about. The termination letter from Morrison & Associates still sat on the kitchen counter, its corporate language unable to mask the brutal reality. After 23 years of faithful service, Margaret Patterson was no longer needed. The company was downsizing, they said, restructuring. She'd received a generous severance package and excellent references, but what they couldn't give her was the sense of purpose that had gotten her out of bed every morning for more than 2 decades. The spiritual retreat center in Colorado's Rocky Mountains had seemed like a sign when she'd found it online at 3. In the morning, sleepless and scrolling through endless articles about finding yourself after 40. The Harmony Hills retreat promised 7 days of meditation, self-discovery and healing in the pristine wilderness outside Denver. The photos showed peaceful women sitting in lotus positions, their faces serene and purposeful. Margaret had booked immediately, using her credit card before she could talk herself out of it. "I have to do this," she whispered to herself, the same words she'd repeated like a mantra for the past 2 weeks. "I have to do this for me." The drive to Cedar Rapids Regional Airport took 45 minutes, and Margaret spent every one of them fighting waves of anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. She'd packed and repacked her small navy suitcase 3 times, each time removing something else she'd deemed unnecessary. The final contents were sparse: a few changes of clothes, toiletries, the journal Claire had given her for Christmas, and a small framed photo of Emma from her high school graduation. The photo had been David's idea, but Margaret had loved it instantly. Emma stood in the middle of their backyard, her cap slightly askew, her smile radiant with possibility. "She looks so confident," Margaret had said that day, and David had squeezed her hand. "She gets that from you," he'd replied. Now, looking at the photo tucked into her carry-on, Margaret wondered where that confidence had gone. When had she become this frightened, hollow version of herself? The airport was smaller than she'd expected, with only 2 gates and a single security checkpoint. Margaret arrived nearly 3 hours early, her nerves making it impossible to calculate appropriate travel time. She sat in the vinyl chairs near the departure gate, watching families say goodbye, business travelers type urgently on their phones, and elderly couples navigate the terminal with practiced ease. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were, going and why. First time flying alone? The voice belonged to a woman about Margaret's age, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore a United Airlines uniform and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years helping nervous travelers. Margaret nodded, embarrassed by how obvious her anxiety must be. "Is it that obvious?" "Only because I've been doing this for 15 years, the woman smiled. "I'm Susan Mitchell, gate agent. I saw you check in earlier and figured you might need someone to talk to." "Big trip." "Colorado," Margaret said, surprised by how good it felt to tell someone. "A retreat center in the mountains. I'm trying to figure some things out." Susan's expression softened with understanding. Those are the best trips, you know. The ones where you're not running towards something, but running toward yourself. I did something similar after my divorce. Scared me to death, but it was the best thing I ever did. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. Susan sharing stories of her own journey to independence, her decision to leave her small town in Minnesota for a career that let her help people find their way to new places. Margaret found herself talking about David, about Emma, about the crushing weight of feeling invisible in her own life. It was the first honest conversation she'd had in months. Flight 247 to Denver is now boarding, Susan announced when she returned to her post. That's you, Margaret. Gate A2. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady. The moment she'd been dreading and anticipating for weeks was finally here. She gathered her purse, her carry-on, and the book she'd brought but hadn't opened once during her 3-hour wait. You're going to be fine, Susan said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine conviction. Trust me, sometimes the scariest thing is exactly what we need to do. The boarding process was efficient and surprisingly calming. Margaret found her window seat in row 14, stowed her carry-on in the overhead compartment, and settled in for the 2-hour flight. The businessman in the aisle seat nodded politely, but immediately returned to his laptop. The middle seat remained empty, a small blessing that felt like a sign. As the plane taxied down the runway, Margaret pressed her face to the window and watched Iowa disappear below her. The neat squares of farmland gave way to rolling hills, then to the vast expanse of the Great Plains. She'd lived in the same state for 41 years, rarely venturing beyond its borders, except for the occasional family vacation to Wisconsin or Illinois. Now, with each mile the plane traveled, she felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. The flight attendant, a young woman with a bright smile and confident demeanor, stopped by Margaret's row during the beverage service. "First, time to Colorado?" she asked, somehow intuiting Margaret's nervous energy. "Yes," Margaret replied. "I'm going to a retreat center in the mountains." "Oh, how wonderful. I bet it's beautiful this time of year. Are you traveling alone?" The question that would have made Margaret cringe a month ago now felt like a badge of courage. "Yes, I am, for the first time in my life." "Good for you," the flight attendant said with genuine enthusiasm. "That takes real courage. I hope you have an amazing time." Margaret accepted her ginger ale and small bag of pretzels, realizing that she was actually hungry for the first time in days. The constant knot in her stomach had loosened somewhere over Nebraska, replaced by something that felt almost like anticipation. She opened her journal and began to write, her handwriting shaky at first, but growing steadier with each word. Day 1 of what I'm calling my journey back to myself. I'm on an airplane, flying alone for the first time in my life. I'm scared, but I'm also proud. David used to say I was too dependent, too afraid to try new things. Maybe he was right. Maybe that's part of why he left, but I'm trying now. I'm trying to become the person I was before I became afraid of everything. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Denver. Margaret looked out the window again, this time seeing the Rocky Mountains rising in the distance like ancient guardians. The retreat center was another hour's drive into those mountains, but first she had to navigate Denver International Airport. DIA was massive, nothing like the small regional airport she'd left behind. The terminal stretched endlessly in both directions, filled with thousands of travelers moving with purpose. Margaret envied. She followed the signs to baggage claim, her small suitcase circling the carousel among dozens of others. The luggage carousel was hypnotic, each revolution bringing her closer to the next phase of her journey. The shuttle driver to Harmony Hills Retreat was a weathered man in his 60s named Jack, who'd been making the mountain run for 8 years. He loaded Margaret's suitcase into the back of his van and helped her into the passenger seat with the kind of practiced kindness that came from years of dealing with nervous retreat participants. "First time?" he asked as they pulled away from the airport. "How does everyone know?" Margaret laughed, surprised by the sound of her own voice. "You get a look," Jack said, his eyes kind. "Like you're excited and terrified at the same time. It's a good look. Means you're doing something that matters." The drive through the mountains was breathtaking. Margaret had never seen landscapes like this. Towering pines, massive rock formations, and air so clear it seemed to sparkle. With each mile they climbed, she felt further removed from her old life, from the person she'd been that morning when she'd stood in her kitchen holding the confirmation email. "Tell me about the other people who come to the retreat," Margaret said, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. Jack was quiet for a moment, navigating a particularly steep curve. "All kinds. Business people burned out from the corporate world, folks going through divorces, people who've lost loved ones. Sometimes younger people trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives, but mostly people like you, people like me. People who've been taking care of everyone else for so long, they forgot to take care of themselves. People who wake up one day and realize they don't know who they are anymore." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Is it that obvious?" "Only because I've driven this route about 1,000 times. You're all brave, you know. Takes real courage to admit you need help finding yourself." The retreat center appeared around a bend in the road, like something from a fairy tale. A collection of rustic buildings nestled into the mountainside, connected by stone paths and surrounded by gardens that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Margaret could see people walking slowly along the paths, some alone, some in small groups, all of them moving with the kind of peace she'd been chasing for months. "Here we are," Jack said, pulling up to the main lodge. 7 days to figure out what comes next." Margaret stepped out of the van, breathing the thin mountain air and feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope that had sustained her through the divorce proceedings and the job loss, but something stronger, something that felt like possibility. The check-in process was handled by a serene woman named Patricia, who explained the retreat schedule with gentle enthusiasm. Meditation at dawn, group discussions in the morning, individual reflection, time in the afternoon, and evening sessions focused on goal setting and personal growth. Meals were communal, served in the dining hall, with its massive windows overlooking the valley below. Margaret's room was small but comfortable, with a simple bed, a desk, and a window that faced the mountains. She unpacked her few belongings, changed into comfortable clothes, and sat on the bed to call Claire. "I made it," she said when her sister answered. "I'm here, and it's beautiful." "I'm so proud of you," Claire said, and Margaret could hear the emotion in her voice. "How do you feel?" "Scared, hopeful, like I'm about to find out who I really am." "You're going to do great, Maggie. You're stronger than you know." Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the grounds, introducing herself to other retreat participants, and attending her first group session. The other women, and a few men, shared stories that echoed her own. Job losses, divorces, empty nest syndrome, the feeling of being lost in their own lives. But there was something else in their voices, something Margaret hadn't heard in her own voice for years: determination. That evening, she sat in the dining hall with 3 other women, sharing a simple meal of soup and bread. They talked about their lives, their fears, their hopes for the week ahead. Margaret found herself laughing for the first time in months, really laughing, the kind that came from deep in her chest and made her feel alive. "I was so afraid to come here," she admitted to the group. "I've never done anything like this before." None of us have, said Jennifer, a woman from Phoenix who'd left her job as a high school principal after 30 years. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we had to get lost before we could find ourselves. As Margaret walked back to her room that night, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The mountain air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and the distant sound of a stream. She stood on her small balcony, looking up at more stars than she'd ever seen in Iowa, and felt truly grateful for the first time since David had packed his bags. She opened her journal and wrote, "Day 1, complete. I did it. I traveled alone, talked to strangers, shared my story, and didn't fall apart. I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Tomorrow we start the real work, figuring out who Margaret Patterson is when she's not defined by her job, or her marriage, or her role as a mother. I'm ready. I think I'm finally ready." The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn for the first meditation session. She'd never meditated before, but something about sitting in silence with a group of strangers, watching the sun rise over the mountains, felt like coming home. The retreat leader, a woman named Sarah with calming presence and genuine warmth, guided them through breathing exercises and mindfulness techniques that seemed to quiet the constant chatter in Margaret's mind. Recovery isn't about forgetting who you were, Sarah said during the morning group session. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who you should be. Margaret spent the afternoon hiking alone on one of the mountain trails, her journal tucked into her backpack. She found a quiet spot beside a mountain stream and wrote page after page, pouring out years of suppressed thoughts and feelings. She wrote about her marriage, about the gradual erosion of her sense of self, about the way she'd become invisible even to herself. But she also wrote about possibility, about the woman she glimpsed in moments of quiet confidence, about the life she might build if she could find the courage to reach for it. The days at the retreat passed in a blur of revelation and growth. Margaret participated in group discussions, individual counseling sessions, and creative workshops that helped her rediscover interests she'd abandoned years ago. She painted watercolors of the mountain landscape, wrote poetry for the first time since high school, and had conversations with fellow retreatants that felt like rediscovering the art of human connection. By the 5th day, Margaret felt like a different person. Not entirely transformed, she was too practical to believe in overnight miracles, but awakened. She woke up each morning with energy instead of dread, looked forward to each activity instead of enduring them, and found herself laughing, easily and often. The constant knot of anxiety in her stomach had loosened, replaced by something that felt like anticipation for what came next. "You look different," Jennifer observed during lunch on day 6. "Not just happier, but more present, like you're actually living in your own life instead of watching it happen to someone else." Margaret knew exactly what she meant. For the first time in years, she felt like the protagonist of her own story, instead of a supporting character in everyone else's. She was making decisions based on what she wanted, instead of what she thought others expected of her. She was speaking her truth, instead of carefully editing her words to avoid conflict. She was, for the first time in decades, unapologetically herself. The final evening of the retreat was bittersweet. Margaret had formed genuine friendships with several of the other participants, and they exchanged contact information with promises to stay in touch. She felt ready to return to Iowa, but not to her old life. She was ready to build something new, something that honored the person she'd rediscovered in these mountains. "What's next for you?" Sarah asked during their final one-on-one session. "I'm going to find a new job," Margaret said with confidence that surprised her. "But not just any job, something that matters to me. And I'm going to start dating again when I'm ready. And I'm going to travel more. I want to see places I've never been, meet people I've never met. I want to live, not just exist. As Jackie drove her back to the airport, Margaret felt a mixture of sadness and excitement. She was leaving a place where she'd found herself, but she was also taking that self with her. The retreat had given her tools and confidence, but more importantly, it had reminded her that she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined. "How do you feel?" Jack asked as they approached the airport. "Like I'm finally awake," Margaret replied, "like I've been sleepwalking through my own life, and now I'm finally awake." The airport was busy with afternoon travelers, but Margaret navigated it with ease this time. She checked her bag, went through security, and found her gate without the anxiety that had consumed her a week earlier. She was still the same woman who'd arrived in Denver 7 days ago, but she was also fundamentally different. She knew who she was now, and she liked that person. As she settled into her seat for the flight home, Margaret opened her journal one final time. Day 7. I'm going home, but I'm not going back to my old life. I'm going forward to something new. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready for whatever comes next. I'm ready to be me. The flight from Denver to Cedar Rapids was smooth, but Margaret found herself unable to concentrate on the book she'd brought. Her mind kept wandering to the plans she'd made during her final night at the retreat. She'd written a detailed list of changes she wanted to make: find a new job that aligned with her values, redecorate her house to reflect her own taste instead of David's, maybe even adopt the dog she'd always wanted but never gotten because David was allergic. As the plane descended through the clouds, Iowa spread out below her like a patchwork quilt. She felt a surprising surge of affection for the landscape she'd called home for 4 decades. The retreat had taught her that running away wasn't the answer. Finding herself was, and she could be herself anywhere, even in Cedar Falls. Claire was waiting at the gate when Margaret emerged from the jetway, and the sisters embraced with an intensity that surprised them both. "You look amazing," Claire said, holding Margaret at arm's length. "Seriously, you look 10 years younger." "I feel it," Margaret laughed. "I feel like I've been sleeping for years, and now I'm finally awake." They talked continuously during the drive home, Margaret sharing stories from the retreat, while Claire filled her in on the family news she'd missed. Emma had called twice, asking about her mother's trip with what sounded like genuine interest. David had stopped by once to pick up more of his belongings, but he'd seemed subdued, even disappointed when Claire told him Margaret was away. "I think he expected you to be sitting at home feeling sorry for yourself," Claire said carefully. "He seemed surprised that you were off having an adventure." Margaret considered this information without the sharp pain she would have felt a week earlier. David's opinion of her choices no longer held the power to devastate her. She was making decisions for herself now, not in reaction to his approval or disapproval. The house looked exactly the same, but Margaret experienced it differently. Instead of feeling trapped by its familiarity, she saw potential. The living room could be rearranged to create a reading nook by the window. The spare bedroom could become an art studio. The backyard could house the vegetable garden she'd always wanted. That evening, Margaret called Emma at college. Her daughter's voice carried a warmth that had been missing from their recent conversations. "Mom, you sound so different," Emma said. "Happy, really happy, not just pretending to be okay." "I am happy," Margaret realized as she said it. "For the first time in years, I'm actually happy." "I'm proud of you," Emma said, and Margaret heard David's voice in the cadence, but also something uniquely her daughter's. "It takes courage to change your life. Dad always said you were too afraid to try new things, but I never believed that. I always thought you were just waiting for the right moment." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you, sweetheart, more than you know." I love you too, Mom, and I can't wait to see this new version of you. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Margaret updated her resume, highlighting skills she'd developed over 23 years at Morrison & Associates, but focusing on her ability to solve problems, manage crises, and help people navigate complex situations. She realized she'd been more than just an insurance processor. She'd been a counselor, a problem solver, and a source of stability for countless clients facing their worst moments. She applied for positions at non-profit organizations, family, counseling centers, and even the local hospital's patient advocacy program. Each application felt like a step toward a more meaningful life, work that would utilize her skills while serving a purpose that mattered to her. The phone rang on Thursday afternoon while Margaret was reorganizing her closet, donating clothes that belonged to the old version of herself. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up on the fourth ring. Mrs. Patterson, this is Detective Linda Morrison from the Cedar Rapids Police Department. I'm calling about your missing person report. Margaret's blood ran cold. I'm sorry, what missing person report? The report filed on September 10th by your sister, Claire Harrison. She reported that you'd failed to return from a trip to Colorado and weren't answering your phone. But I'm here, Margaret said, confusion making her voice shaky. I returned from Colorado yesterday. I was only gone for a week. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ma'am, according to our records, you were reported missing on September 10th. Today is September 24th. You've been gone for 3 weeks. Margaret sank into her bedroom chair, her mind reeling. That's impossible. I was at the Harmony Hills retreat for 7 days. I flew back yesterday on United Flight 442. I have my boarding passes. Mrs. Patterson, I'm going to need you to come to the station. There seems to be some confusion about your whereabouts, and we need to clear this up. Margaret's hands were shaking as she hung up the phone. She looked at her travel documents, spread across her dresser. The dates were clear. Departure on September 3rd, return on September 10th, but Detective Morrison had said today was September 24th. She called Claire immediately. Claire, what day is it? It's Thursday, September 24th. Maggie, where have you been? I've been worried sick. You were supposed to call when you got back from Colorado, but that was 2 weeks ago. I filed a missing person report when you didn't. Enter your phone. Margaret's vision blurred. Claire, I just got back yesterday. I've been calling you. We had dinner last night, don't you remember? Maggie, I haven't seen you since I dropped you off at the airport. That was 3 weeks ago. Are you okay? You sound confused. The room spun around Margaret. She looked at her phone, scrolling through her recent calls. There were no calls to Claire, no calls to Emma, no calls to anyone since September 3rd, the day she'd left for Colorado. I'm coming over, Claire said, her voice tight with worry. Don't go anywhere, just stay put until I get there. Margaret sat on her bed, staring at her travel documents. The boarding passes were there, the retreat center brochure, even the journal she'd filled with reflections about her week in the mountains. But if Claire was right, if today was really September 24th, then where had she been for 2 weeks? She opened her journal to the last entry, the one she'd written. On the plane yesterday, day 7, I'm going home, but I'm not going back to my old life. But the date at the top of the page was September 10th, not September 23rd. Claire arrived 30 minutes later, her face pale with worry. She pulled Margaret into a desperate hug, tears streaming down her face. Thank God you're okay. I thought something terrible had happened to you. Claire, I need you to tell me exactly what you remember, Margaret said, struggling to keep her voice steady. When did you last see me? I dropped you off at the airport on September 3rd. You were nervous but excited. You said you'd call when you got to the retreat center, but you never did. I tried calling you every day, but your phone went straight to voicemail. On September 10th, I called the retreat center, and they said you'd never checked in. They said a shuttle driver had been waiting for you at the Denver airport, but you never showed up. Margaret felt the world tilt around her. That's impossible. I was at the retreat. I have memories of 7 days there. I met people, I participated in sessions, I hiked in the mountains. Maggie, I called the police, the hospitals, even the airlines. United Airlines confirmed you'd boarded the flight to Denver, but there was no record of you on the return flight. Security footage at Denver International showed you getting off the plane, but then you just disappeared. Margaret's mind raced through her memories of the retreat. Every detail was vivid and clear. The mountain air, the taste of the simple meals, the sound of Sarah's voice during meditation, the feel of the watercolor brush in her hand. But if Claire was right, if today was September 24th, then none of it had happened. I need to call the retreat center, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Claire handed her the phone. I have the number memorized. The woman who answered the phone at Harmony Hills Retreat was professional but confused. I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson, but we don't have any record of you staying with us this month. We had a full retreat from September 3rd through 10th, but you weren't registered for that session. But I was there, Margaret insisted. I met Jennifer from Phoenix and Patricia at the front desk and Sarah who led the meditation sessions. I'm sorry, but we don't have anyone named Patricia or Sarah on our staff, and I'd remember if we'd had a guest who didn't check in properly. Margaret hung up the phone, her hands shaking. She looked at Claire, who was watching her with growing concern. I remember everything, Margaret said. The flight to Denver, the shuttle driver named Jack, the room with the mountain view, the other guests, the hiking trail by the stream. It's all real to me. But you never made it to the retreat center, Claire said gently. According to the shuttle service, they never sent anyone to pick you up. They said you never called to confirm your arrival. Margaret felt reality shifting around her like sand. She looked at her suitcase, still packed from her trip. Inside were the clothes she'd worn at the retreat, the journal she'd written in, even a small stone she'd picked up on the mountain trail. But if she'd never been to the retreat, where had these things come from? I think we need to go to the police station, Claire said. Detective Morrison needs to know you're safe, but she also needs to know what happened or what you remember happening. The drive to the police station was silent, both sisters lost in their own thoughts. Margaret clung to her memories of the retreat, afraid that if she examined them too closely, they would evaporate like morning mist. But she also couldn't ignore the evidence, the missing 2 weeks, the lack of phone records, the retreat center's denial that she'd ever been there. Detective Morrison was a woman about Margaret's age, with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. She listened patiently as Margaret recounted her memories of the retreat, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but never expressing doubt or disbelief. Mrs. Patterson, she said finally, I need to ask you some questions that might seem strange, but I want you to answer them as honestly as you can. Margaret nodded, her throat tight with anxiety. Do you remember feeling confused or disoriented during your time at the retreat? No, I felt clearer than I had in years. Do you remember any periods of time where you felt like you were watching yourself from outside your body? Margaret hesitated. Now that she thought about it, there had been moments during the retreat when she'd felt almost dreamlike, as if she were floating above her own experiences, but she'd attributed that to the meditation and the mountain air. Maybe, she said slowly. During some of the meditation sessions, I felt very detached, but I thought that was normal. Do you remember eating regular meals? Do you remember being hungry? Margaret tried to recall the sensation of hunger, the taste of food at the retreat. The memories were vivid, but somehow insubstantial, like trying to hold water in her hands. "I remember eating," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Simple meals, soup and bread, but now that you mention it, I don't remember being hungry." Detective Morrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to tell you something. The security footage from Denver International Airport shows you getting off the plane on September 3rd, but then you disappear from the cameras for approximately 6 hours. The next time you appear, you're in a completely different part of the airport, and you seem disoriented and confused." Margaret's vision blurred. "What do you mean?" "The footage shows you wandering through the terminal, appearing to be looking for something or someone. You approach several airport employees, but they all report that you seemed confused about where you were supposed to be. Eventually, you collapse in a bathroom stall." "Collapse?" "You were found unconscious by a janitor around 11 p.m. You were taken to Denver General Hospital, where you remained in what doctors described as a dissociative state for 13 days. You were conscious but unresponsive to questions about your identity or what had happened to you." Margaret felt the room spinning around her. "That's impossible. I was at the retreat. The hospital tried to identify you, but you had no identification with you. Your purse and luggage were found in the airport, but there was no way to connect them to you until yesterday, when you suddenly became responsive and asked to be discharged." "Yesterday?" "September 23rd. You gave the hospital staff your name and your sister's phone number. They called Claire, but she was so shocked to hear from you that she asked them to keep you overnight for observation. You were discharged this morning and took a taxi home." Margaret stared at Detective Morrison, her mind reeling. "But I remember the taxi ride from the airport yesterday. I remember unpacking, calling Emma, reorganizing my closet." "According to your medical records, you were experiencing what doctors call confabulation. Your brain was creating false memories to fill in gaps in your consciousness. The retreat you remember never happened, Mrs. Patterson. You've been in a dissociative state for 3 weeks." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She doubled over in her chair, struggling to breathe. Claire moved to sit beside her, wrapping her arms around her sister's shaking form. "I need to know what happened to me," Margaret whispered. "I need to know why I lost 2 weeks of my life." Detective Morrison's expression grew grave. "That's what we're trying to figure out. The airport security footage shows you disappearing from the cameras for 6 hours on September 3rd. During that time, there's no record of where you were or what happened to you. When you reappear, you're clearly in distress." "You think something happened to me during those 6 hours?" "I think something happened that was traumatic enough to cause your mind to shut down for almost 3 weeks. Your brain created the retreat memories as a way to protect you from whatever really occurred." Margaret looked at her hands, trying to reconcile the vivid memories of mountain air and meditation sessions with the stark reality of hospital rooms and lost time. What could have happened in 6 hours that would cause this? "We're investigating," Detective Morrison said, "but I need you to be prepared for the possibility that we may never know. Sometimes the mind protects us from memories that are too painful to process." As they left the police station, Margaret felt like she was walking through a dream. The world looked the same, but everything had changed. Her memories of transformation and growth at the retreat, memories that had felt so real, so life-changing, were nothing but elaborate fantasies her traumatized mind had created. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked Claire as they sat in the car. "How do I move forward when I don't know what happened to me?" Claire squeezed her hand. "We'll figure it out together. The important thing is that you're safe now." But as Margaret looked at her house, at the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, she realized that safety was an illusion. Somewhere in Those missing 6 hours at Denver International Airport, something had happened that her mind couldn't bear to remember. And until she knew what that was, she would never truly be safe. That night, Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling, afraid to close her eyes. She was terrified that if she fell asleep, she might wake up to discover that even this reality was false, that her mind had constructed another elaborate fantasy to protect her from the truth. She reached for her journal, the one she'd filled, with reflections from the retreat that had never happened. Her handwriting looked back at her, documenting experiences that existed only in her traumatized mind. But as she read through the pages, she realized that even false memories could contain truth. The woman who had written these entries was someone who yearned for independence, for purpose, for the courage to build a new life. That woman was real, even if her experiences weren't. Margaret closed the journal and made a decision. She might not know what had happened to her during those missing hours, but she knew who she wanted to become. The retreat might have been a fantasy, but the insights it had given her were real. She would find a way to honor the person she'd discovered in those false memories, even as she worked to uncover the truth about what had really happened at Denver International Airport. She picked up her phone and dialed Emma's number. Her daughter answered on the second ring. "Mom, are you okay?" Aunt Claire called and said you were found, but she was pretty vague about the details. "I'm okay, sweetheart. It's complicated, but I'm okay. And I want you to know that I love you, and I'm going to figure out how to be the mother you deserve." "Mom, you're scaring me. What happened?" Margaret looked out her bedroom window at the familiar Iowa landscape. "I lost myself for a while, but I'm going to find my way back, I promise." As she hung up the phone, Margaret felt a strange mixture of devastation and determination. She'd lost 3 weeks of her life, but she'd also gained something invaluable, the knowledge that she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined. Even if the retreat had been a fantasy, the transformation it had represented was real. She just had to figure out how to achieve it in the real world. The next morning, Margaret woke with a sense of purpose that surprised her. She called in sick to her job search activities and instead drove to the library, where she spent hours researching dissociative states, memory loss, and trauma recovery. She learned that the mind's ability to create false memories was both fascinating and terrifying, a survival mechanism that could protect someone from unbearable experiences. She also learned that recovery was possible, that people could heal from even the most severe psychological trauma. It would take time, therapy, and patience, but she could reclaim her life and her identity. That afternoon, she made an appointment with Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma and dissociative disorders. As she hung up the phone, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since Detective Morrison had shattered her understanding of reality: hope. She might not know what had happened to her at Denver International Airport, but she knew what she wanted to happen next. She was going to heal, she was going to grow, and she was going to build the life she'd glimpsed in her false memories. The retreat might have been a fantasy, but the woman who had experienced it was real, and she was ready to fight for her future. Dr. Sarah Chen's office was nothing like Margaret had expected. Instead of the sterile clinical environment she'd imagined, the space was warm and inviting, with soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and walls lined with books that suggested both professional expertise and personal warmth. Dr. Chen herself was a woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Margaret at ease. "I've reviewed the police reports and your medical records from Denver General," Dr. Chen said, settling into her chair across from Margaret. "What I'd like to do today is hear your story in your own words. Tell me about what You remember, starting from the morning of September 3rd, Margaret took a deep breath and began to recount her memories of the retreat. As she spoke, Dr. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, but never showing any sign of judgment or disbelief. When Margaret finished, she felt drained but also oddly relieved. "Those memories feel completely real to you," Dr. Chen observed. "They're not fragments or impressions, but full, detailed experiences." "Absolutely. I can still taste the mountain air, feel the texture of the watercolor paper, hear the sound of the stream by the hiking trail. It's more real to me than this conversation in some ways." Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "That's not unusual for confabulated memories, especially when they're created as a protective mechanism. Your brain didn't just manufacture random experiences. It created a narrative that gave you exactly what you needed at that moment in your life." "But why? What was I protecting myself from?" "That's what we need to explore together. The fact that you were found unconscious in an airport bathroom suggests that something traumatic occurred during those missing 6 hours. Your mind created the retreat experience as a way to avoid processing whatever really happened." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of traumatic event could cause someone to dissociate for 3 weeks? Many things: physical assault, psychological manipulation, witnessing violence, being threatened or coerced. The important thing to understand is that dissociation is a survival mechanism. Your mind did what it needed to do to protect you. Over the following weeks, Margaret began the slow process of therapy. Dr. Chen used a combination of techniques designed to help her process her trauma while maintaining her psychological stability. They worked on grounding exercises, helping Margaret distinguish between her false memories and reality, and slowly exploring the gaps in her recollection of September 3rd. "I want to try something called guided imagery," Dr. Chen said during their 4th session. "I'm going to help you relax, and then we'll carefully explore what you do remember about that day. We'll go slowly, and you can stop at any time." Margaret agreed, though she felt nervous about confronting whatever her mind had been hiding from her. She settled into the comfortable chair and closed her eyes, following Dr. Chen's instructions to breathe deeply and relax each part of her body. "Take me back to the airplane," Dr. Chen said softly. "You're on the flight to Denver. What do you see?" Margaret found herself reliving the flight with perfect clarity. The businessman with his laptop, the empty middle seat, the kind flight attendant who had praised her courage. These memories felt solid and real, unmarred by the confusion that surrounded her recollections of the retreat. "Now you're landing in Denver," Dr. Chen continued. "The plane is taxiing to the gate. How do you feel?" "Nervous, but excited. I'm proud of myself for making the trip alone. I'm looking forward to the shuttle ride to the retreat center." "You're walking through the airport now. What do you see?" Margaret's brow furrowed as she tried to access this memory. "It's crowded. Much bigger than I expected. I'm looking for the baggage claim following the signs." "You're at the baggage claim now. What happens next?" Margaret's breathing quickened. "I'm waiting for my suitcase. It's taking a long time. There are so many people." "You have your suitcase now. What do you do next?" "I'm looking for the shuttle pickup area. I have instructions from the retreat center. I'm supposed to meet Jack, the driver, but..." Margaret's voice trailed off. "But what, Margaret?" "I can't find him. There are so many people with signs, but none of them say Harmony Hills or have my name. I'm starting to panic." Dr. Chen's voice remained calm and steady. "What do you do when you can't find the shuttle?" Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. I ask someone, a man in a uniform. He says he can help me find the right shuttle." "Describe this man." Margaret struggled to bring the memory into focus. "He's tall, maybe in his 40s. He has a badge like airport security. He seems official, professional. He says there's been a mix-up with the shuttle schedules, but he can help me get where I need to go. What happens next? Margaret's breathing became more rapid. He takes me to a different part of the airport. Says we need to check with his supervisor about the shuttle situation. I'm following him, but I'm getting confused. We're going down corridors I don't recognize. How do you feel? Scared. I want to go back to the main terminal, but I don't know how to get there. He keeps saying it's just a little further, that his supervisor will sort everything out. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. Margaret, I want you to know that you're safe now. You're in my office and nothing can hurt you. If you need to stop, just say so. Margaret nodded, though her eyes remained closed. I want to keep going. I need to know what happened. The man is leading you somewhere. Where do you end up? It's like an office, but not a regular office. It's in a part of the airport that doesn't feel like the airport. There are no windows, no signs, just a desk and some chairs and fluorescent lights. Is anyone else there? Yes, a woman. She's older, maybe in her 60s. She has gray hair and she's wearing a suit. She looks official, important. What does she say to you? Margaret's voice became smaller, more frightened. She says there's been a problem with my travel documents, that I need to answer some questions before I can continue to my destination. What kind of questions? About why I'm traveling alone, about my divorce, my job loss. She knows things about me, personal things. She says they're just routine security questions, but it doesn't feel routine. Dr. Chen's expression grew concerned. How long does this questioning last? I don't know. It feels like hours, but I can't tell. There are no windows, no clocks. They keep asking the same questions over and over. They want to know if I'm having thoughts of hurting myself, if I'm mentally stable, if I might be a danger to other passengers. How do you respond? I keep saying I'm fine, that I just want to go to my retreat. But they seem to think I'm lying. The woman keeps saying that people who travel alone after major life changes are often in crisis, that they need to be evaluated for everyone's safety. Margaret's hands were shaking now. I want to leave, but the man is standing by the door. I ask for a phone to call my sister, but they say I can't contact anyone until the evaluation is complete. Ndil, what happens during this evaluation? They give me forms to fill out, psychological questionnaires. They want to know about my mental health history, my relationship with my family, my reasons for traveling. I'm getting more and more scared, but I don't know what else to do. Dr. Chen's voice remained steady. You're doing very well, Margaret. You're safe now. What happens next? Margaret's face contorted with distress. I start to panic. I realize this isn't normal airport security. I try to leave, but the man blocks the door. The woman says I need to calm down, that they're just trying to help me. And then she offers me water, says it will help me relax. I'm so scared and confused that I drink it, but it tastes strange, bitter, and then Margaret's voice faded to a whisper. And then I can't remember anything else. Everything goes dark. Dr. Chen waited a moment before speaking. Margaret, I want you to slowly open your eyes and come back to the present. You're in my office, you're safe, and you've done incredibly brave work today. Margaret opened her eyes, tears streaming down her face. They drugged me. Those people drugged me. It appears so, Dr. Chen said gently. What you've described sounds like you were subjected to some form of unauthorized detention and possibly drugged without your consent. This would explain the dissociative episode and the memory loss. But why? Why would airport security do that to me? I don't think they were real airport security, Margaret. I think you encountered people who were posing as officials, people who targeted you for reasons we don't yet understand. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that she finally had an explanation for what had happened to her, and horror at the implications of that explanation. What did they do to me during those hours I can't remember? We may never know for certain, Dr. Chen said carefully, but the fact that you were found unconscious in a bathroom suggests that whatever they did, it was serious enough to cause severe psychological trauma. Margaret spent the rest of the session working through the implications of her recovered memories. She felt validated, knowing that her instincts about the retreat being false were correct, but also terrified by the reality of what she'd experienced. Someone had deliberately targeted her, drugged her, and subjected her to hours of questioning, and possibly other forms of abuse. "I want to go to the police," Margaret said, as the session ended. "I want to report what happened." "I think that's a good idea," Dr. Chen agreed, "but I want you to be prepared for the possibility that it may be difficult to investigate. These people clearly knew what they were doing, and they may have covered their tracks well." That evening, Margaret called Detective Morrison and requested a meeting. She also called Claire, who listened to her sister's account with growing horror and anger. "I knew something terrible had happened to you," Claire said. "I could see it in your eyes. Even when you were talking about the retreat, you looked traumatized, not transformed." "I'm going to find out who did this to me," Margaret said, with a determination that surprised her. "I'm going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The next day, Margaret returned to the police station, this time accompanied by Claire, and armed with her recovered memories. Detective Morrison listened to her account with professional interest, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions. "This is extremely concerning," Detective Morrison said when Margaret finished. "What you're describing sounds like a sophisticated operation designed to target vulnerable travelers. We need to contact the FBI and the airport authorities immediately." "Do you think they'll be able to find these people?" "I don't know," Detective Morrison admitted, "but we have to try. If this happened to you, it may have happened to others. We need to investigate whether there's a pattern of people disappearing or experiencing trauma at Denver International Airport." Over the following days, Margaret's case became part of a larger investigation. FBI agents interviewed her extensively, collecting every detail she could remember about her captors and their methods. They were particularly interested in her description of the unofficial office space and the sophisticated knowledge the woman had about her personal life. "This suggests advanced planning," Agent Catherine Rodriguez explained during one of their interviews. "Someone may have been monitoring your travel plans and targeting you specifically." "But why me? I'm nobody special. I'm just a divorced woman from Iowa who lost her job." "That may have been exactly why they chose you," Agent Rodriguez said. "You were isolated, vulnerable, and unlikely to be missed quickly. You fit a profile of someone who could disappear without immediately raising alarms." The investigation revealed disturbing patterns. Airport security footage from other dates showed similar incidents. Travelers being approached by people in unofficial uniforms, taken to areas of the airport that weren't part of normal operations, and then disappearing for hours before being found in distressed states. "We've identified at least 6 other cases over the past 3 years," Agent Rodriguez told Margaret during a follow-up interview. "All of them involve people traveling alone, usually during emotionally difficult periods in their lives. All of them experienced memory loss and psychological trauma." Margaret felt sick. "There are others?" "Yes. And like you, they all initially believed they had different experiences from what actually happened. Their minds created false memories to protect them from the trauma." "Have any of the perpetrators been caught?" Agent Rodriguez's expression was grim. "Not yet, but your case has provided the most detailed information we've had. Your recovered memories may be the key to identifying and stopping these people." As the investigation continued, Margaret focused on her own healing. She continued therapy with Dr. Chen, slowly processing the trauma she'd experienced while learning to distinguish between her false memories and reality. It was difficult work, but she found strength in knowing that her recovery might help prevent other people from suffering similar experiences. The retreat memories, while false, had given her a blueprint for the person she wanted to become. She applied for positions at victim advocacy organizations, drawing on her own experience to help others who had survived trauma. She also began speaking to women's groups about travel safety and the importance of staying connected with family during trips. "I may not have gone to a retreat in the mountains," she told one group, "but I learned something valuable about survival and resilience. Our minds have an incredible ability to protect us from experiences that could destroy us. The false memories my brain created weren't lies. They were a gift that allowed me to survive until I was strong enough to face the truth." 3 months after her initial disappearance, Margaret received a call from Agent Rodriguez. "We've made arrests," she said. "3 people have been charged in connection with your case, and the others we've identified." Margaret felt a mixture of relief and vindication. Who were they? A group of individuals who were conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on travelers. They were targeting people they identified as vulnerable, subjecting them to various forms of psychological manipulation and drug testing. But why? We're still investigating their full motivations, but it appears they were collecting data on how people respond to trauma, possibly for resale to organizations interested in psychological control techniques. Margaret felt nauseated. They were using us as test subjects? It appears so. But thanks to your courage in coming forward and recovering your memories, we've been able to stop them and help their other victims. As Margaret hung up the phone, she felt a strange sense of completion. She'd lost 3 weeks of her life, but she'd also gained something invaluable: the knowledge that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. She'd survived a horrific experience, recovered her memories, and helped bring her attackers to justice. The woman she'd imagined herself becoming during the false retreat memories was still there, waiting to be discovered. She just had to find her through healing and growth rather than through fantasy. And for the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, Margaret felt truly hopeful about her future. 6 months after her ordeal, Margaret stood in her newly redecorated living room, looking at the framed certificate on her wall. She'd completed her training as a certified victim advocate and had just accepted a position with the Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault. The work would be challenging, but she felt uniquely qualified to help others navigate the complex aftermath of trauma. The house looked completely different now. Gone were the neutral colors and conservative furniture David had preferred. In their place were warm yellows and deep blues, comfortable chairs arranged around a large window that flooded the room with natural light. She'd turned the spare bedroom into an office where she could work from home, and the backyard now boasted the vegetable garden she'd dreamed of. Emma was home for spring break, and Margaret marveled at how their relationship had evolved. Her daughter, now a junior in college, had become one of her strongest supporters throughout the recovery process. "I'm proud of you, Mum," Emma said, curling up on the new sofa with a cup of tea. "Not just for surviving what happened to you, but for turning it into something meaningful." "I had a good teacher," Margaret replied, settling into her favorite chair. "Watching you grow into such a strong, independent woman showed me what was possible." The trial had been difficult, but ultimately satisfying. All 3 defendants had been convicted on multiple charges, including kidnapping, assault, and conducting unauthorized medical experiments on human subjects. Margaret had testified about her experience, helping the jury understand the sophisticated nature of the psychological manipulation she'd endured. Your courage in coming forward has helped us identify and assist 12 other victims, the prosecutor had told her after the verdict. Without your testimony, these people would never have faced justice. Margaret had also learned more about the scope of the operation. The defendants had been part of a larger network that targeted vulnerable travelers at airports across the country. They developed detailed profiles of potential victims, looking for people who were isolated, emotionally distressed, and unlikely to be missed quickly. They chose you because you fit their criteria perfectly, Dr. Chen had explained during one of their sessions. A middle-aged woman traveling alone for the first time, recently divorced, recently unemployed, with limited social connections. You were exactly the kind of person they thought they could victimize without consequences. But they'd underestimated Margaret's resilience and her support system. Claire had refused to give up searching for her sister, and her persistence had ultimately led to the investigation that brought the perpetrators to justice. Emma had provided unwavering support throughout the recovery process, and Dr. Chen had helped her rebuild her sense of self and safety. The false memories of the retreat had gradually faded, but Margaret had learned to appreciate them for what they'd been. Her mind's way of protecting her from unbearable trauma while giving her a vision of who she could become. The confident, independent woman she'd imagined herself being at the retreat was no longer a fantasy. She was a goal Margaret was actively working toward. "I got a letter today," Margaret told Emma, pulling an envelope from her purse. "From one of the other victims. She wanted to thank me for speaking out." Emma read the letter, her eyes growing bright with tears. "She says you inspired her to leave an abusive marriage, that watching you testify gave her the courage to rebuild her own life. That's the most rewarding part of all this," Margaret said, "knowing that surviving something terrible can help other people survive their own challenges." Margaret had also reconnected with several of the other victims from the airport incidents. They'd formed an informal support group, meeting monthly to share their experiences and support each other's healing. Each woman had a different story, but they all shared the common bond of survival and the determination to reclaim their lives. What's interesting, Dr. Chen had observed during one of their sessions, is that all of you have become stronger and more independent as a result of your experiences. The trauma was horrific, but the way you've processed it has led to genuine growth and transformation. Margaret had been thinking about that observation as she prepared for her new job. The woman who'd boarded the plane to Denver 6 months ago had been lost, frightened, and dependent on others for her sense of identity. The woman who would start work as a victim advocate next week was confident, purposeful, and committed to using her experience to help others. "I want to take a trip," Margaret announced to Emma over dinner. "A real trip, not to escape or find myself, but just to see new places and have new experiences." "Where do you want to go?" "The Grand Canyon. I've always wanted to see it, and now I realize I don't need anyone's permission to go. I can just decide to go and then do it." Emma grinned. "I love this version of you, Mom. You're like the person you always were, but louder and more confident. I spent so many years making myself smaller to avoid conflict or to make other people uncomfortable. I'm done with that. I survived something that was designed to break me, and I'm still here. I'm not going to waste that gift by playing it safe." Margaret had also made peace with David, who'd reached out after learning about her ordeal. He'd offered to help in any way he could, and while they would never reconcile as a couple, they'd found a way to be friends again. More importantly, Margaret had realized that his opinion of her choices no longer mattered. She was making decisions based on her own values and desires, not in reaction to his approval or disapproval. "I think I understand now why the retreat memories were so powerful," Margaret told Dr. Chen during one of their final sessions. They weren't just false memories. They were my unconscious mind's way of showing me who I could become. Every quality I admired in the woman I imagined myself being at the retreat was actually a part of me that had been suppressed, not created. Oh, that's a profound insight, Dr. Chen agreed. Trauma can sometimes strip away the false layers we've built up over the years, revealing our authentic selves underneath. Your mind created a fantasy that allowed you to see your own potential. Margaret had been accepted to speak at a conference on trauma recovery, sharing her story with other survivors and mental health professionals. She was nervous about the presentation, but also excited about the opportunity to help others understand the complex ways the mind processes trauma. I want to tell them that recovery isn't about forgetting what happened to you, she'd told Dr. Chen while preparing her remarks. It's about integrating the experience into your life story in a way that makes you stronger, not weaker. The day of the conference, Margaret stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of survivors, therapists, and law enforcement officials. She'd prepared extensively for this moment, but as she began to speak, she realized she didn't need her notes. Her story had become part of her now, not something separate from her identity, but an integral part of who she was becoming. 6 months ago, I was a woman who was so afraid of being alone that I'd never traveled by myself, she began. I was so dependent on others for my sense of worth that I'd forgotten who I was underneath all the roles I played. I thought I was broken, finished, too old, and too scared to build a new life. She paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. Then something terrible happened to me. I was targeted by people who saw my vulnerability as weakness, who thought they could victimize me without consequences. They were wrong about the consequences, but they were right about my vulnerability. I was lost, isolated, and easy to manipulate. Margaret continued, describing her ordeal and the long process of recovery. She spoke about the false memories, the slow return of awareness, and the difficult work of healing. But she also spoke about the unexpected gifts that had emerged from her trauma. I discovered that I was much stronger than I'd ever imagined. I learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's courage. I found out that I could survive the worst experience of my life and still choose to help others. Most importantly, I realized that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. The audience was completely silent, hanging on her every word. Margaret felt a power she'd never experienced before, the power that comes from speaking truth about painful experiences. The woman I am today is not the same person who boarded that plane to Denver, she concluded. She's stronger, braver, and more purposeful. She's also more compassionate, more aware of suffering, and more committed to preventing others from experiencing what she went through. I wouldn't choose to go through that trauma again, but I also wouldn't trade the person I've become as a result of surviving it. The standing ovation that followed was overwhelming. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she looked out at the audience of survivors and supporters. She'd found her voice, her purpose, and her strength in the aftermath of her worst experience. Later that evening, Margaret sat in her hotel room, reflecting on the day. She thought about the woman who'd packed her suitcase 6 months ago, so frightened and hopeful, looking for transformation in a mountain retreat. That woman had found what she was looking for, just not in the way she'd expected. She opened her current journal, a new one purchased after she'd processed the reality of her false memories, and began to write. Today, I spoke my truth to a room full of strangers, and I felt more like myself than I have in years. I realize now that the retreat I imagined was never about the place. It was about the person I was capable of becoming. I found that person not in the mountains of Colorado, but in the depths of my own resilience. I found her in the choice to heal rather than simply survive, to grow rather than simply endure, to help others rather than simply help myself. Margaret closed the journal and prepared for bed. Tomorrow, she would fly home to Iowa, where her new life was waiting. She'd start her job as a victim advocate, continue her work with other survivors, and keep building the independent, purposeful life she discovered she was capable of living. As she drifted off to sleep, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the trauma she'd endured, but for the strength she'd discovered in herself, the support she'd found in others, and the opportunity to transform her pain into purpose. She'd lost 3 weeks of her life, but she gained so much more: her authentic self, her voice, and her mission. The woman who'd been targeted because of her vulnerability had become an advocate for others facing similar challenges. The person who'd been chosen as a victim had chosen to become a survivor. And the traveler who'd been lost in an airport had found her way home to herself. Margaret's story had become one of transformation, but not the kind she'd originally sought. Instead of escaping her life, she'd learned to embrace it fully. Instead of running from her pain, she'd learned to transmute it into strength. Instead of seeking someone else's version of healing, she'd created her own. She was finally awake, finally alive, finally free. If Margaret's story touched your heart, if you felt that flutter of recognition when she found her courage, or if you've ever faced your own moment of choosing between fear and freedom, I want you to know that you're not alone. Each of us carries within us the capacity for transformation, for healing, for becoming the person we were meant to be. This story exists because stories like Margaret's matter. They remind us that survival is possible, that healing is real, and that our worst experiences don't have to define us. They can refine us. If you found meaning in Margaret's journey, please hit that subscribe button and join our community of survivors and supporters. Leave a comment sharing your own moment of courage, your own story of transformation, or simply your thoughts on Margaret's incredible journey. Remember, you are stronger than you know, braver than you feel, and more loved than you might believe. Your story matters, your voice matters, and your healing matters. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for choosing to face each day with courage. Until next time, keep holding on to hope, keep believing in your own strength, and keep moving forward, one brave step at a time.